Hi, my name is Riley Esparza, and this is my honors research project on the history, impact, and future of conservation photography. When we talk about conservation photography, we focus on three main aspects: exposure, advocacy, and ethics. It's important to note that conservation photography is a balance between disturbing images and aesthetically pleasing images. Through both the provocative and the beautiful images taken, consumers are exposed to parts of the world that they normally would not have seen, both positive and negative. With exposure comes advocacy to improve our environment and speak up for those who cannot speak up for themselves. And an incredibly important part of conservation photography is the preservation of ethical practices while taking impactful photographs. It is vital that photographers focus on honesty and integrity, which includes not staging photographs or disturbing the environment. It may be easier for a photographer to bring food to lure animals or move logs around in a more aesthetic way for a more visually appealing photograph, but this goes against the ethical responsibility that each conservation photographer carries. Nature's had an incredible impact on art as a whole, but especially in the realm of photography. In fact, nature impacted photography before photography was known as photography, and this was through the anthotype and cyanotype processes. In 1842, Sir John Herschel created the anthotype process, where he opened the door to the sustainable integration of nature into the physical development process of images. The anthotype process utilized and encouraged recycling fallen leaves, flowers, and other parts of plants to create a lasting image on a medium, and 180 years later in 2022, it can still be used. Towards the end of 1842, Sir John Herschel outdid himself and created the cyanotype, which quickly overshadowed the anthotype. Like the anthotype, the cyanotype beautifully displayed fixed images of plants, but in comparison to the anthotype, the cyanotype produced an inverted color scheme. This means that the plant's permanent images captured through the anthotype were darker with a light background, whereas the cyanotype produced darker backgrounds, cyan, with white images. Although the anthotype and cyanotype processes are not directly rooted in conservation, these processes today, namely the former, facilitate sustainability in the photography community, which in turn influences conservation practices today. Before conservation photography became a well-known genre of photography, the romantic aesthetic further proves that we have almost an innate obsession with preserving nature as it is. Reaching its peak in 1800, 40 years after its conception, the romantic aesthetic integrated the calotype while it emphasized the picturesque and featured rushing brooks, overgrown foliage, and tumble-down structures. And the romantic aesthetic was created as a way to combat the Eurocentric artistic aesthetic as a whole, which was designed to be conformist and oppressive in nature, and having the potential to lead to alienation, depression, and dehumanization. One aspect of the romantic aesthetic that I appreciate is the fact that even though it was not created with the same intentions as conservation photography movements in the United States, it was still created with pure intentions to better the world. A large part of my research was surrounding key artists who have greatly impacted the conservation photography movement in the United States and conservation as a whole. The first artist who unknowingly started the artistic conservation movement in the United States was not actually a photographer. Although he wasn't a photographer, George Catlin was one of the most influential artists that really got the conservation movement started in the United States. In 1832, Catlin proved that not everyone embraced manifest destiny, which was contrary to what was believed to be the unanimous consensus in the United States. Catlin rejected the idea that manifest destiny was entirely beneficial to the United States because of his concern towards the natural environment and its inhabitants, such as the indigenous population that was already being actively driven out of their land. George Catlin also famously stated a novel idea that by some great protecting policy of government, a magnificent park, a nation's park, containing man and beast, in all the wildness and freshness of their nature's beauty. This was incredibly important because this was the first notable time that someone expressed the idea of a natural park. And this truly is marked as the beginning of the legacy of conservation in the United States. In the 1800s came my favorite photographer, Carlton E. Watkins. In the late 1800s, Watkins photographed early San Francisco, Yosemite, Mendocino, and the Sierra Nevada mining regions. and in my opinion, his best photographs were of Yosemite Valley. These photographs of Yosemite Valley were also arguably the best photographs taken of this region as well. Watkins bravely utilized mammoth plates and took hundreds of photos with heavy equipment as he trekked through the undeveloped Sierra Nevada region. As his photographs of Yosemite Valley began to gain popularity, Congress began to examine the images, which were accurate and fair representations of the breathtaking land in the Sierra region. It was through Watkins' stylization and his determination that former President Lincoln signed an act in 1864 which stated that California shall accept this grant upon the express conditions that the premises, the Sierra Nevada region and Merced River, also known as Yosemite Valley, shall be held for public use, resort, and recreation, shall be inalienable for all of time. In signing this act, former President Lincoln safeguarded the Yosemite environment, which paved the way for other regions of the United States to be protected under the law in order to preserve the natural beauty. After Watkins journeyed through the Sierra Mountains, a retired Civil War soldier named William Henry Jackson began an expedition with the director of the United States Geological Survey and a painter. This expedition was through Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. At this point in history, the concept of the Wild West was still very much alive, even though manifest destiny and exploration in the United States was underfoot. Throughout the span of the expedition, Moran and Jackson extensively documented the grandeur of the region, and when they returned from their expedition, the ball was in motion. Upon returning from their journey, Hayden pronounced his findings to Congress, including Moran's paintings, and at this point in time, Congress was nearly unconvinced that this region was truly as magnificent as depicted in the paintings. This was where Jackson's photographs came in. With Jackson's photographs as undeniable proof of the absolute beauty in the Wild West, former President Grant was faced with a choice that changed how we preserve nature, not only in the United States, but across the globe. On March 1st, 1872, Grant signed the bill to make Yellowstone the first national park, and after Yellowstone National Park was established, many more would come. The last photographer I researched is an amazing photographer who is still alive, named Sant Khalsa. Khalsa is a professor at California State University, San Bernardino, but she is the founder and co-founder of 3 conservation-based organizations: the Joshua Tree Center for Photographic Arts, Joshua Tree Arts Professionals, and Water Resources Institute Research Center, according to her narrative biography on her website, and she has created quite the lasting legacy. In addition to inspiring the next generations of conservation photographers through formal education, Khalsa has had her photographs shown in 4 main museums across California and Nevada. Khalsa has also earned many awards because of her photography, and these awards were given from a wide range of agencies, such as the Center for Photographic Art in Carmel, to an award from the Environmental Protection Agency, a government agency. Personally, I do not think that any of these formal awards or her place in museums are her greatest achievements. In my opinion, her greatest achievement is the impact that she has had on a region in the Big Bear Wilderness, found in San Bernardino County. In 1992, Khalsa became concerned about the lasting effects that the California gold rush had on Holcomb Valley, and because of this, she decided to make a change. Khalsa traveled to Holcomb Valley and planted over 1,000 ponderosa trees in order to offset the detrimental effects of the gold rush, and she cleverly named this passion project Growing Air. With my experience with camping, hiking, and photography in Holcomb Valley, there is still sadly a trace left behind from the gold rush, but Khalsa's efforts certainly have not gone unnoticed. The last topic I wanted to cover is the future of conservation photography. One prevalent issue in our current climate is the lack of consideration that many tourists have towards conservation and the environment, even those who consider themselves conservation photographers and nature lovers. Social media has had an immense effect on this lack of consideration because when influencers post photos of aesthetically pleasing places, a significant increase in tourism occurs. However, the relationship between conservation photography and tourism is very complex. Especially in our technologically charged world, Everyone with a camera is suddenly a photographer. When photographers and tourists neglect to follow the principles of leave no trace, the environment becomes destroyed, which is why we need to enforce the ethical responsibilities of conservation photography and photographers as a whole. I strongly believe that if we continue to honor the conservation artists that have come before us, and if we follow the legacies of conservation artists in our modern world, we can continue to promote conservation and create a lasting effect, a positive lasting effect for once. As part of the outside aspect of the honors project, I visited different areas in Southern California and took pictures in order to model the same principles of conservation photography. In order to do so, I took some disturbing images as well as visually pleasing images. But unfortunately, due to time constraints, I'm unable to present all images that I took. Starting with the more unsettling images I took, I wanted to reinforce the idea that our stain on Earth is plaguing what could be beautiful images. The image on the left, without cement or trash in the foreground, the background would certainly be more pleasing. And with the image on the right, the stain that we have on the earth is more subtle in order to evince the idea that our stain is suddenly becoming part of our natural world. And this is a problem, because without looking for the actual problem, we're choosing to ignore the issues at hand. With the right image especially, it's almost a slap in the face to the conservation movement, because as stealthily hidden in the foreground is a bottle of urine, which represents the act of defilement that we evoke without a second thought. As part of a mini project I have been working on for the past few years, I've looked through images that went towards this project, which is designed to enforce accountability for our unsustainable and damaging actions. This includes graffiti and littering as represented in these, and all three images were taken in a way where the viewer cannot help but think, wow, this would be a better image if the photographer neglected to include trash and graffiti. This thought in of itself is problematic, yet is the first step that we must address in order to further push for accountability and further conservatory change. Because instead of thinking that the photographer was at fault because they didn't go out of their way to hide our stain, that's a problem because we are ignoring our own stain. In these images, I wanted to showcase a sense of hope yet fear that I have with our wildlife and environment. With the left image, deer are grazing in the middle of the woods. However, it is very clear that there's not much for them to consume. Tree stumps are also showcased, which is a painful reminder of unsustainable habits and lasting effects on our wildlife that we have had. And in turn, these lasting effects that we have on the wildlife's ability to thrive is very apparent. With the image on the right, a newly planted tree is seen in the foreground, yet a large open area is also showcased in the background because of our overconsumption. Although the small tree represents hope that we're trying to do better, we are reminded that the road to rebuilding is one we cannot see the end of in our lifetime. Similar to the last image, the image on the left represents hope, but is quickly overshadowed by the image on the right, which shows a distinct difference between the concentration of trees to the left of this image and the obvious lack of trees on the right of the image. My first thought when I looked at this part of the valley was, the entire valley should look like the area on the left, not the area on the right. With these two images, I wanted to reinforce the idea that conservation photography is more than just looking at everything we are doing wrong. With these images, I wanted the viewer to be able to simply enjoy our natural world in order to prevent the viewer from thinking, well, our world is already ugly, so there's no point in fixing the unfixable. This I wanted to bring back to the origins of conservation photography, because artists such as George Catlin, Ansel Adams, Carlton E. Watkins, they all emphasize the beauty that we have, and that's what inspired many to work towards conservation efforts. With this last one, I wanted to showcase and model more traditional conservation photography where images of the natural world are taken as a method of appreciation, just as I mentioned before. Thank you for watching. For more information, visit these resources.